That's right, we're right here, Sharp Facets Gallery. How you doing this afternoon? I'm Ann Eller. And we have one of the contenders, actually the one who, according to the latest poll, is the most contender for Lindsey Graham's seat. That's right. We have Richard Cash. He's running for the U.S. Senate. He wants to take Lindsey out. How you doing today, Richard Cash?
Doing great today. We're about 12 days away from the vote. And of course, when you get a poll within 2 weeks that says you're the top contender, that makes you happy.
Yeah. But these last 2 weeks can be brutal.
Well, you know, the last 2 weeks can also be fun because this is the time when the voters are really starting to pay attention. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you're not just talking to the ceiling or whatever. So, you know, this is really the fun time of the campaign. That's the way I look at it for sure.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a long campaign for you. You've been campaigning for Lindsey Graham's seat since
April 15th, 2013. I was the first one to get in, and I will say this, Ann, I got in when Lindsey was probably polling in the high 60s. Mm-hmm. In June of 2013, I put $200,000 of my own money in the race and said I'd spend it all to try to beat him. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm not one who got in because he had sunk below 50 and there was, you know, all of a sudden an opportunity. I mean, I got in because I felt like on principle he had to be challenged.
And I know that this is your second go-around with politics. Your first one, and this is where I met you originally, was back in 2010 when it was running for Gresham Barrett's seat.
Right, that was an open seat, and 8 people got into that race. 6 finished the race, and it's kind of interesting because 6 finished the race, and there's 6 challengers in this race. So, you know, I'm hoping there's a repeat because in that race I did make it into the runoff, and which I eventually lost in a close vote to Jeff Duncan. But hopefully, you know, if we can do a good job the next 12 days, I'll end up in a runoff with Lindsey Graham.
Sure. Now, just out of curiosity, Richard, how do you think that Jeff Duncan is doing?
I think Jeff's doing great. I mean, I knew Jeff obviously after a year on the campaign trail. I knew if Jeff got in there, he was going to be a solid conservative voice for South Carolina, and he's proven to be every bit that. You know, I would be voting the same way Jeff was voting if I was up there, which is, of course, is the reason I'm not running against Jeff. You know, I'm running against Lindsey because Lindsey's not voting the way that I would be voting.
Okay. All right. I just remember you being highly critical of Jeff Duncan at the time.
You know, we were opponents, and you're trying to beat the other guy. But,
okay.
But you know, I could have tried to come back and run against Jeff, but there was really no point. You know, we were kind of splitting hairs trying to find any policy differences between us, but that's just not the case with Senator Graham. There's some major differences here, important differences, and differences that are going to really impact the country over the next couple of decades.
It could be the whole future of our country.
It could be.
Could be, that's right. Now, Richard, you are, let's see, you are a businessman. Have been for the last, what, 15, 20 years? How long?
Well, I've had 3 careers, Ann. When I got out of college, my first career was as a corporate computer programmer analyst. I did that for about 7 years. My second career was as a pro-life activist. That was in the 1990s. And then since '99, the last 15 years, I started and developed 2 small businesses from the ground up.
And what businesses are those?
Well, one is an ice cream truck business, which means I own a fleet of these little trucks that come around the neighborhood and play music and make your kids happy.
Right.
And I own a used car business. Now, you know, some people say, used car business? And I'm like, well, Ann, I don't know, you know, if trying to be a politician is a step up or a step down from used cars.
Well, that could be a question
that
here,
could be a question for people. But anyway, those are my businesses. That's how I support my family. I've been married for 29 years. I have 8 children. Ages 10 to 25.
Is that why you got in the ice cream business? You needed jobs for all of them?
You know, I don't want them to have anything to do with the ice cream truck business, but I remember telling people when I was running for Congress, I figured I'd need 1 truck per child just to float my boat.
Right.
So anyway, 3 of those kids are in college right now. So one's out and she's a nurse, she's married, and we still have 4 at home. But 5 of them count it, five of them are now voters.
Voters.
Yes.
So you got at least 5 votes
There
here.
you go. And we got a head start on the other candidates because I don't think anyone else has got 5 kids who are voting age.
And Lindsay doesn't have any kids, so we don't have to consider that either, do
There
we?
you go.
All right. Well, there you go. All right. Well, we are here with Lindsay. Lindsey Graham? No, we're here with Richard Cash. He wants Lindsey Graham's seat here today. So when you think about Lindsey Graham and his record, what are the things that you particularly have issue with?
Well, there's been a couple of things that I've talked about over the past year that I think where Senator Graham is certainly out of step with South Carolinians. The most egregious thing is the way he has voted on Supreme Court nominees. I like to remind people that Senator Graham was the only Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee to vote in favor of Sonia Sotomayor, and South Carolina was livid about that. And then a year later, he became the only Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee to vote for Elena Kagan. And he says he will continue to vote for justices if he thinks they are qualified. And here's my contention. Both of these justices have track records as judicial activists. And if someone really doesn't believe in constitutional interpretation according to original intent, then as far as I'm concerned, they're not qualified, because the Constitution can't just be whatever the justices want it to be. And so I think Senator Graham has let South Carolina down. These are 2 justices that will probably serve for 20 or 30 years. And here's one example. About 3 weeks ago, there was a case on religious liberty. I'm sure you remember it. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that legislative bodies could open their prayers, and that if someone prayed in Jesus' name, it was actually not unconstitutional. So we got a little bit of religious liberty back. Well, 2 of the justices who voted against that were, not surprisingly, Sotomayor and Kagan. So it would have only taken one more vote from, if President Obama puts up another justice, or President Clinton, if we have a President Clinton, only one vote to switch a lot of these 5-4 votes. And we just cannot afford any more judicial activists on the Supreme Court.
So you think they should have struck them down and started over? Do you think we would have ended up with somebody even more worse?
I think you can only, in a sense, be responsible for your vote. Mm-hmm. Now, as I said, he was the only Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee to vote for either one of them. He's responsible for his vote. If they had made it on the Supreme Court anyway, we wouldn't be talking about this. But he voted for them. And he can't get away from that. He can't get away from the damage they're going to do in the next 2 or 3 decades being on that Supreme Court. So, I'm holding him accountable for what he did. Whether they would have made it without his support, they probably would have. Or whether someone else worse would have been sent up, that's a possibility. Mm-hmm. But you still have to do what is right, and he didn't do what is right. And he said he's going to continue to vote this way. And we have 2 more years of President Obama, and then there'll be another election. And if we have a President Hillary Clinton, he's going to be voting and approving her justices. And I don't like that either.
All right. Well, there you go. You heard it right here on WCRS. We are talking with Richard Cash. He wants to be get the next U.S. Senate seat. And we're going to talk more. If you've got questions, don't hesitate to give us a call, 229-7984. That's 229-7984. Give us a call right now. Let's hear a quick word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. Oh, that's right. We're right here, Sharp Facets Gallery. I'm Ann Eller here with Richard Cash. He wants to be the next U.S. Senator. He wants to take Lindsey Graham's seat. So, Richard, we were talking a little bit about judicial activism. You said you had 2 that were top on your issue with Lindsey Graham. What is the second one?
The second one would be the issue of illegal immigration. And I think we ought to talk about this a few minutes. And I want to start by saying that, I am not against immigration. We are a nation of immigrants. But we are also a nation of laws. And the two things don't have to be in opposition to one another. There are people who apply to immigrate here and they do it lawfully. And, you know, when you take those people and say, well, these other people have jumped the border, but we're going to put them on a pathway to citizenship, you make a mockery of your own laws. Now, this is what Senator Graham advocates for, pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants. It undermines the rule of law, and furthermore, it will certainly serve as an incentive for additional people to become illegal immigrants. In fact, I truly believe that if his bill was passed, number one, we would not have border security. And number two, if his bill was passed, I believe in 5 or 10 years, we'd be sitting here having a conversation about what are we going to do with the 5 or 10 million new illegal immigrants that are here. He presents this like it's a one-time solution for illegal immigration, and the problem will go away if this bill is passed. It won't go away. It will simply encourage the next wave of illegal immigration. I'm old enough to remember 1986 and the amnesty that happened then. And President Reagan lived to regret that because he didn't get border security, and we still don't have it.
Correct.
We still don't have it.
Do you think there should be a fence between Mexico and the
I
U.S.?
certainly feel like fences make for good neighbors, you know. So
That's an old quote, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and most people, you know, don't see any problem with having a fence between them and their neighbor. It keeps certain things in, it keeps certain things out. So, you know, wherever a fence is needed, we ought to build a fence. Now, we have all kinds of solutions, some low-tech like a fence and some very high-tech like unmanned drones.
Sure.
There's no reason this can't be done other than a question of political willpower. Senator Graham does not have any willpower to do this. He has joined with the Democrats in their non-solution, which is to simply make illegal immigrants citizens, and we'll continue to get more of the same. In fact, I'm concerned if he's reelected, he will eventually get this bill passed.
Well, do you think there is a will in Congress to pass any bill on immigration?
There is certainly a will to start with the problem of border security. Now, the problem is this. The Democrats say we won't do that unless it's a total package. Well, any thinking American realizes once they get the total package, they're not going to be too concerned about the part of that package that has to do with border security, because they don't care about that part now. And so, you know, a conservative says, wait a second, we played this game in 1986 and ever since, and we're not going to do that again. You know, we want a standalone border security bill. It's got to be the kind of thing of stop talking about it and let's actually do it. And so Senator Graham has begun the conversation on terms that can only lead to a Democratic victory, and it should be laid at his feet. He's leading not just his party, but the entire country down the wrong road.
Excuse me, Richard, sorry.
It's okay.
So, if Lindsey Graham isn't there, will there be in the Senate, you think there can be a bill to do something?
I think for a different bill to come out of the Senate, then obviously we are hopeful of the Republicans being back in the majority in the Senate. But we want some different kind of Republicans, you know, making up that majority.
Go ahead.
And Senator Graham is simply not the right kind of Republican to get the job done. Now, while we're talking about immigration, you know, I want to make a couple of other comments just to let people know I'm not against immigration. And the United States is not against immigration. We admit more immigrants to our nation every year than any nation in the world. Furthermore, over the past 3 decades have been 3 of the largest decades of immigration in our country's history. So no one is against immigrants. In fact, right now, 1 out of every 8 people in America is foreign born. Okay, so we have a tremendous number of immigrants right now, about 40 million. And about 30 million are here legally. No one's complaining about that. We are simply saying to the 10 or 12 million who are here illegally, That's not right. You don't get a reward for breaking the law. And Lindsey Graham wants to give them the biggest reward, which is citizenship.
What do we do with that 12 or 13 million that are illegals? How do you deal with that?
Well, we have to take away some of the incentives that are in place that cause people to come here illegally. In particular, we have to make it difficult for them to get employment. If you can't get a job and that's why you've come here, then you will find a way to go home since you found a way to get here. And you know, I'm talking about something like E-Verify, something that you know, makes it very difficult for businesses and very dangerous for them to employ illegal immigrants. That has to be in place. We have to address not just border security, but also the subject of incentives.
How about anchor babies?
Anchor babies are a big problem. In fact, this should be part of the conversation. Anchor babies should be something that we address. In other words, if two illegal immigrants come here and have a baby, that baby's citizenship should follow the parents' citizenship.
Oh, that's a radical idea.
No, that's a pretty common sense idea. And most conservatives agree that you don't get a reward for breaking the law. So we also should be talking about chain migration or chain immigration, where, you know, we're giving preference to people to bring their immediate family over, and then that group is allowed to bring their immediate family, and it just goes on, and it has greatly skewed our immigration numbers and where our immigrants are coming from. Even though we were promised when this was passed in the mid-1960s that it wouldn't do that, Ted Kennedy promised us that, by the way, it has in fact done that. So we should be addressing these kinds of issues. We should be addressing the issue of assimilation. You know, 100 years ago we had great numbers of immigrants, but we had a consensus in this country that assimilation was a paramount concern.
And by saying assimilation, are you talking about that people were proud to be Americans?
Proud to be Americans, but now, you know, our country has shifted to what I believe is a mistaken notion of celebrating multiculturalism. You know, several European leaders have spoken up in the past year or two and said, you know, that's just failing. You know, our society is fragmenting. You know, if people need to have their allegiance, you know, to the country that they are living in, and an emphasis that says, you know, retain your primary identity in the country you've come from, is going to cause a fragmentation in our culture. So that's part of the reason why we should really be talking about lowering the immigration numbers for a while until we've had a period of assimilation, because we have had 3 decades of tremendous numbers of immigration here.
Well, you know, I think that's a great point that you bring up, Richard, but do you think with the direction that the country is going, which is very much towards all sides of it, as you say, as opposed to assimilation, do you really think that people would pull back and say this is the right way to go?
It's happening in Europe. I mean, if in Europe they are realizing that multiculturalism is a failure and dangerous, you know, to the health and future of their societies, I don't see why we couldn't have the same conversation and discussion here in America and perhaps reach the same conclusion. So I do think there's an opportunity to change the direction of the country. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be running. I mean, I've invested a lot of money and a lot of time away from my family. If I didn't believe there was hope for America, I wouldn't be here today. I do believe there's hope to change the direction and future of the country, but we're going to have to elect some different people who want to go in a different direction than Senator Graham wants to take us.
Right. Well, we are here with Richard Cash. We're going to hear the Join the News in progress, and we'll be right back.
Are you a pirate or a pack rat? Do you have a vacation of a lifetime sitting in the attic? Or a college tuition hung on a wall? Or is a fabulous retirement hidden in your jewelry box? Bring those items to Sharp Facet's gallery. We can establish value and buy from you or sell for you. And so ends another chapter at Sharp Facets Gallery, 72 Bypass, and on the web, sharpfacets.com.
You know, Richard, we are right here with Richard Cash. Yes, he's running for U.S. Senate. He wants Lindsey Graham's seat. He's been campaigning for a long time. He's down to 2 weeks in the primary, and he's ready to take on a primary challenge, are you?
Oh, well, I'd love to be in that runoff. I mean, it would be quite a trip, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You know, when you have a runoff, anything's possible.
That's true. That is true. So, you know, when you talk about going to Washington, what would you see? How long would you think would be appropriate? I know that there's a lot of talk about term limits. Some people are saying they will do self-imposed term limits. What is your feeling about term limits, Richard, and how long would you go for?
Well, you know, I talked about that a lot when I ran for Congress. In fact, when I ran for Congress, I took a self-imposed term limits pledge of 10 or 12 years in the House. That was it. So I haven't forgotten about that, and I do favor term limits. In fact, I think term limits should apply both to reps, to senators, and also to the Supreme Court. I really think they should be limited to 18 years and no more.
You don't think we should have 90-plus-year-olds still in the Supreme Court?
That gets a little, you know, unstable in my mind, that people can be 90-something and be on the Supreme Court. You know, for most of our country's history, the average tenure of a Supreme Court justice was about 17, 18 years. But recently it has spiked upward to 25 and 30 years, and of course, you know, we have a lot of advances in medicine and innovation there that allow this to happen. And of course, we've already talked about the problem of judicial activism, that sometimes the judges are actually acting like a supra-legislature. If they're already acting that way, why do we want to give them, you know, lifetime tenure in office? So I would certainly introduce, sponsor, co-sponsor a term limits amendment. So the question does become, you know, will you take a self-limiting pledge? And I haven't to this point. I may still before, you know, primary day. I haven't to this point. One concern I have is that Lindsey Graham might try to use that against someone in a runoff. That he would say, well, I'm the senator who gets things done because I have seniority. And this person's a lame duck before they ever set foot in Washington, so to speak. And so I have, you know, that has crossed my mind. You know, a lot of people want term limits, but they don't want their conservative congressman or senator to have a self-imposed limit while this liberal Democrat is not taking the pledge and is not going to vote for the law.
Sure.
And so some people look at it, and after several years, I can see the point of view a little bit easier as kind of like unilateral disarmament. That we got to get both sides to do this at the same time for it to work.
Sure.
I think, you know, at this point, and I don't want to get too deep into the idea of the Convention of the States, but there are some things that are going to be so difficult to get through Congress and amend the Constitution. Term limits is one of them, and a balanced budget is the other.
Oh, my God, a balanced budget?
I think in both cases that the percentage of Americans that want term limits and the percentage that want a balanced budget probably approaches 80%. And yet, the likelihood that either amendment will ever come out of Congress and be sent to the states is almost nil. Well, there's only two methods of amending the Constitution, and the other is the Convention of the States, and that's why I think that we should take a serious look at that, because the likelihood of getting balanced budget or term limits, those are two things Congress doesn't want, and yet they're the body that has to pass them by a 2/3 majority before the states can ever vote on them. So there you have it. It's kind of a long explanation. I think we need term limits. How do we get there is certainly a question.
You know, one of the things that I talked to all of our congressmen, and one of the things, of course, is the trade-offs that happen in Congress. And of course, we're not supposed to have any pork in the in the trade-offs, whatever that's called, I can't think. Can you tell me what I'm trying to say? Where we trade one idea for one item at one end for one at another end, and to get people to vote for. And I'm constantly told that if we don't make deals, then it's very hard for anything to happen in Congress or in the Senate. For example, how do you get somebody in Minnesota to vote for deepening the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina? The pork bellies, the stuff that happens to make this happen. What do you feel about that, Richard?
I would be looking at the lead of Jim DeMint on that issue. You know, DeMint went to Washington and actually became a hero of mine. And when it came to this whole thing of pork and earmarks,
That's the word I was
he
looking
realized that was really, when you boil it all down, despite all the arguments about it, it was really a broken system. And so, you know, we need to be talking about how do you do a systemic reform so that we have some above-board type of budgetary process, and not just the senior members of the House and the Senate, you know, rewarding themselves
Sure.
by giving untold extra millions of dollars to their state based on seniority. You know, we've got to upset the apple cart there. Now, you know, I'm willing to try to upset the apple cart. I don't think we can keep on doing what we're doing. And, you know, it takes some new blood of saying, you know, we're just not going to keep doing business this way. You boys have got a $17 trillion in debt. You're obviously not doing a very good job.
Now, how can we get out of $17 trillion in debt?
Better elect some different people to start
But, okay,
with.
what would be the plan to get us out of that debt?
I think the plan has got to be something along the lines of cut, cap, and balance. It's got to start with something more along the lines of zero-based budgeting. This idea that we're going to take last year's budget and increase it 4% across the board, we've got to be done away with that. You know, we've got to take last year's budget and subtract a penny on the dollar, so to speak. Anyone, you know, can use a calculator and figure out that if we just keep, you know, increasing X% per year, that we're just going to keep creating a bigger problem. So, you know, some of these problems are massive, but they're not as complicated as we make them out to be. It's a crisis of will in America, whether we're talking about immigration or whether we're talking about the budget. It's a crisis of will, and sending some people up there like Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, who are willing to take a different approach, even though it might be an unpopular approach.
Well, these are I think this is one of the things that is a big issue, is how to do that. I think, what are we doing with the IRS? What would you see as a way to collect the taxes? Should we do away with the IRS? Should we do away with income tax? What should we do?
Well, I think all ideas should be on the table here. I mean, we didn't have, you know, the IRS and the income tax until about 100 years ago. And obviously, you know, the federal government has grown and kind of gotten out of control, and the whole tax system, you know, has just continued to expand and get more complicated to where people can't even hardly do their own taxes and hope to get them right. So I'm obviously in favor of like simplifying the tax code, the flat tax approach, or a fair tax / consumption-based tax. If we sit down and just think about it, you know, logically and philosophically, probably a lot of people would agree that in the end, it's really none of the government's business how much money you make.
Shouldn't be.
Right.
That's not the American way, as I thought about it.
Right. So, you know, if you have a sales-based type system, then that gets the kind of the government nose out of your business, and probably a lot of people think the government's way too deep into their business. So I think in the short term, the best chance for reform is flattening the tax code and simplifying it. I think in the long term, though, all the options should be on the table. We should be trying to move towards a more of a consumption-based tax, which would have certainly the ability downsize, if not eliminate, the IRS, because it's become an agency that the average American's afraid of. And Americans should not be afraid of their government.
Absolutely. We are here with Richard Cash. He is running for U.S. Senate against Lindsey Graham. Richard, do you have a website?
We do. It's a wonderful website.
Okay.
It's and the reason I say that is just yesterday we released a new television commercial. Mm-hmm. I've had 3 television commercials. The second and the third are playing right now. The third commercial is what we call the truth ad. It's an ad that talks about Lindsey Graham's record. Now, some people call it an attack ad or a negative ad. But, you know, if I'm talking about Lindsey Graham voting for these justices or Lindsey Graham's position on immigration, that's not an attack or negative or in any way untruthful. I'm simply stating what his record is. So we've got an attack ad. If you want to watch it, go to richardcashforsenate.com. When you get to the home page, simply click on that opening screen and you can watch the 30-second ad that we call The Truth.
All right. Well, listen, let's hear a word from our sponsors and we'll be right back. Don't you go away. Oh, that's right. We're right back here. I'm talking with Richard Cash this afternoon, having a very good conversation, and he wants you to vote for him and to replace Lindsey Graham. That is his mission in a nutshell. Would we gather to say that is correct?
Oh, yes. Replace Lindsey. That's on a lot of my signs. Replace Lindsey.
Exactly.
And some people would say, fire Lindsey. I'm trying to be a little bit more genteel. Replace Lindsey.
Okay. All right. Well, before we went to break, we were talking about some of the issues that a senator from South Carolina should be concerned about. What do you think as far as the issues to be concerned about if you were the next senator from the great state of South Carolina?
Well, one we talked about was the port. Mm-hmm. You know, I think the Constitution does give the federal government some involvement in issues like that. So we have a great opportunity there. We've got to make sure that you know, we get what we need from the federal government to get the harbor deepened. I think another issue that is somewhat particular to South Carolina is the energy industry. This is one of the things that actually Representative Duncan's been working on, trying to lessen regulation on offshore drilling. And I think also we've got a regulation problem with the nuclear power industry. You know, South Carolina gets about, I think, 40% of its power needs from nuclear energy when it comes to electricity. And yet, you know, there just aren't new nuclear power plants being built because of really the government impeding that from happening. It's a philosophical issue, and we've got to fight to try to become energy independent in America, so we're not so whipsawed about what's happening this week or next week in the Middle East.
Sure. You know, I have been very surprised that Canada has held off for as long as they have on the XL pipeline. Well,
I mean, that you know, is another issue. I mean, there's so many when it comes to energy. What's happening to the coal plants that, you know, President Obama basically wants to do away with. So there's no shortage of issues with our federal government really stymieing us from becoming energy independent. But a state like South Carolina, that is an important industry, and that's certainly something I would be very interested in participating in that discussion.
Sure. And any idea where you would like to serve on any type of committees that you could that you think that you could bring a lot of background intel to?
Well, the committees that interest me would be things like the Armed Services Committee. I think, you know, one of the basic functions of the federal government is protecting the nation. And I have a little bit different approach to it than Senator Graham does. I think he's a little bit trigger happy when it comes to getting us involved militarily overseas. I think we've got to take a much closer look at how we go about getting involved in war, because we've got to learn from past experiences. And one clear example to me is the war in Syria that Senator Graham wanted to fight. Even though probably 99% of America was not interested in going to war in Syria, Senator Graham decided that this was what the United States should do. And after President Obama said he would go to Congress to get a vote, and then he kind of changed his mind because he realized that he's probably going to lose the vote, and Senator Graham basically came out and said, well, he doesn't need to go to Congress. He should just go ahead and take military action. Basically bypass Congress. This was a war that could only be called an optional war because we had not been attacked by Syria. So we certainly, had the option of either getting involved in what is basically a civil war in Syria or not getting involved. And I think when we have these kinds of situations which are optional, the people get to decide through their elected representatives. The president does not command a king's army, and he shouldn't just have the authority to send the nation into war. Something like Syria might have been a 10-year, trillion-dollar war to establish a constitutional republic after Assad was overthrown and to rebuild the infrastructure. And every thinking person knows that America would have been in charge of that. And yet Senator Graham really wasn't talking about that. He just wanted to get us into a war.
What do you think about, though, Crimea and Putin and that whole issue over there? Should we have gotten more involved?
Well, I don't think we should have gotten involved militarily. There's not anyone in America, including Senator Graham probably, that thinks we should have gone to war over Crimea. Now, everyone is critical, and rightly so, of President Obama's lack of a foreign policy coherence. This goes back really to the beginning when we canceled the missile defense that was supposed to go to Poland.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that maybe it goes back that far, even farther. I mean, he's done one wrong thing after another that has led to Crimea. I mean, this was just not out of the blue. I mean, it's everything he's done has led to this, and this can obviously it could be reversed to some degree by a different president who sends different signals. But I believe that Americans want to get back to several conservative principles, and I will enunciate them. Conservatives believe in peace through strength. We saw that the Soviet Union disintegrated when Ronald Reagan initiated a buildup of our military. They realized they simply couldn't compete. Peace through strength.
Yeah.
I believe conservatives believe that we should only go to war when it's in our vital national interest. We don't go to war when it's in Syria's vital national interest, when it's in our vital national interest.
Okay.
And then I think it would be a conservative principle that war should be a last resort. It should be a last resort when we ask young men and young women to go to a foreign country and perhaps die for the cause of liberty. There should be clear and compelling reasons that we go to war that the average American can understand, and there should be some pretty clear and compelling forethought as to what we're trying to accomplish and how we'll know that we have accomplished that. So I didn't really see any of that with this call to war in Syria. And Senator Graham does present himself as a foreign policy and military expert, and to me that was just bad judgment. Bad judgment on his part.
I want to give you 2 minutes here now to tell everybody why they should vote for Richard Cash. So you're on.
Well, I got into this because I am concerned about the direction our country is going in. I've talked to people for a year about what I believe is our American heritage. I believe our American heritage is based on the ideas and principles that come from Christianity, capitalism, and the Constitution. Capitalism deals with economics. The Constitution is obviously our governing political document. And Christianity always has been the underlying strength of our moral and spiritual foundation. And so I am campaigning on preserving that heritage, which we all know is under attack. I go all over the state, and if I ask people, are we moving in the direction of capitalism or socialism, everybody knows we're moving in the direction of socialism.
This is WCRS right here in Greenwood. Go ahead, Richard.
If I ask them if we're moving in the direction of a constitution or big government Europe, everybody knows we're headed towards big government Europe. And if I ask if we're moving in the direction of secularism or Judeo-Christian values, they all know we're heading in the direction of secularism. When you add all those things up, our ship of state's going in the wrong direction. Now, it matters where the ship of state's going. And we've got to change the course of the ship of state for the sake of our children and grandchildren. Even if we're not too worried about what's going to take place in our lifetime in the next few decades, we've got to be mature enough and thoughtful enough to try to see 50 years down the road where we're going to end up if we keep going in these directions. I'm willing to fight for the heritage that's been handed down to us, because I think we're going in the wrong direction, and I think we have to have some drastic changes if we're going to have an America in 50 years when our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are in the prime of life, an America that is free, an America that is prosperous, an America that enjoys the blessing of God upon it. We've got to have some major changes, and it's got to happen now. We are going in the wrong direction, and we're going fast. We've got to turn it around.
So I guess you want people to vote for you.
I want people to vote for me. I want people to tell their friends and neighbors that this race can be won. First step's getting in Senator Graham in a runoff, and that's on June the 10th, week from this coming Tuesday. Make sure that you've got that date circled and go and vote. They're saying it might be a low voter turnout, and hopefully Senator Graham supporters will think he's got it in the bag and stay home. But we've got 10 days, 12 days to make this happen. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to spend the next 6 years complaining about Lindsey Graham.
Well, there you go. You've been listening to Richard Cash. I'm Ann Eller. Certainly enjoyed having you on the show today, Richard. Thanks for stopping by.
It's been great to be here.
All right. This is WCRS right here in Greenwood. Bye-bye, everybody.